Hello there.
What a political move to stick two fingers up at Suella Braverman.
Politics at Jack and Sam's is the podcast where we tell you what's going to happen next week in the wild world of Westminster.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico, and with me, as always, is the great Sam Coates of Sky News.
Keeping you ahead of the political agenda.
One top civil servant said to me they're 70-30 in favour of thinking something will happen as soon as Monday.
Sam, is it going to happen, yes or no?
Listen to Politics at Jack and Sam's wherever you get your podcasts.
It was a moment the people of Gaza had been praying for. Hamas had agreed to a ceasefire. They even took to the streets, the relief almost palpable. But those celebrations were short-lived, as Israel clearly had other ideas.
It was a very frustrating weekend, Neil, because, we saw hopes being raised. We thought that we were heading towards some kind of a breakthrough. Hamas said that they had accepted the ceasefire. And then we woke up to news of Israeli tanks going into Rafah. So it's going in any number of directions at the moment.
Certainly, you can't have a ceasefire without both sides agreeing to it. Yet, ignoring the United States, the UK, the EU, and pretty much the rest of the world, Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the Israeli military to begin the assault on the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Rafah, which Israel had directed Palestinians towards as a safe place, was now directly in their sights. Israel is re-entering the negotiations, and there remains hope that a path to a deal can still be found. But the military action continues, and Israel now controls the Rafah crossing on the border with Egypt. Aid, fuel, simply cannot find a way through. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, we'll try and work out how close to a deal we really are, and what effect this latest Israeli assault will have on Hamas resolve and the fate of so many Palestinian civilians. Here in the studio, well, you heard him a few moments ago, you'll hear him again in a wee while, our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn. But first, let's turn to Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and himself a former US Middle East negotiator under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Aaron, great to have you with us. What has happened with this ceasefire? Plenty of people believed we were on the cusp of one, including many people in Gaza who even took to the streets in celebration. But it does still feel like we're a distance away. What's happened?
Yeah, I think most people don't but should understand that Middle East negotiations only have two speeds, slow and slower. And let's be clear, you have a principal decision maker, Yahya Sinwar, architect of the October 7 terror surge, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who frankly right now are interested in securing their respective futures rather than cutting any sort of speedy deal that would alleviate the suffering of the people in Gaza and bring relief to the hostage families and bring the hostages home. Sinwar wants to survive this. And the main sticking point in these negotiations concern the issue of comprehensive ceasefire and withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Sinwar believes now, I think, the international community has turned Israel into an international pariah. There's tensions between the United States and its closest ally, Israel, and that Sinwar and Hamas want to continue to be an integral part of whatever political future there is for Gaza. You have a mirror image in many respects in Benjamin Netanyahu, on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. His fate now rests in the hands of a Jerusalem district court, 3 judges, with one of two options, probably conviction, or he cuts a plea deal to leave politics. And Netanyahu has no intention of surrendering to this fate. He, like Sinwar, believes that he can survive, but it's going to have to be in a deal that, in my judgment, is going to be very hard to reach.
Look, is it simply the case that those reports of a ceasefire were somewhat premature, given the fact I've always assumed that was an agreement between two parties? Hamas may well have agreed to something. That does not make it a ceasefire.
No, and it's the curiosity and structural defect of this kind of negotiation that leads to where we are. Sinwar is somewhere 20, 30 meters below ground. Khan Yunis, Rafah, some people say in a tunnel in Sinai, surrounded by hostages. How they're communicating with him is unclear. You have the external leadership who doesn't control anything and is dependent on Sinwar's okay. And then you have indirect mediators. You've got the Qataris who are under pressure from the United States. They're pressing Hamas or encouraging it. The Egyptians have a fundamental stake because of geography in how this turns out. They're now involved. There's no direct negotiations between the two combatants. And as a consequence of that, this indirect process is just vulnerable to all sorts of gamesmanship and chicanery.
I keep returning to the United States because it does seem that they are at the center of this. We have the US president phoning Benjamin Netanyahu, telling him not to go into Rafah. They continue to go into Rafah. You have the United States telling Qatar, as you've already suggested there, that Hamas should be ejected from their country if they continue to refuse a deal, and Qatar is ignoring that. I mean, are we genuinely seeing the limits of United States influence in this region?
Neil, I think you broke the code. It's not just the limits of Washington in this region. The Middle East is littered with the remains of great powers, including Great Britain, who believed wrongly that they could impose their will and their schemes, their dreams, their aspirations and ambitions on smaller ones. In an existential conflict where the parties believe that their vital national interests, and in the case of Sinwar, his very survival is at stake, the influence of external parties are limited. I played a thought experiment with myself the other day. I put in another Secretary of State and another US president and asked myself the question, if President X instead of Joe Biden or Secretary Y instead of Anthony Blinken were there, would they have any better success and luck in these negotiations? I think that the way in which the United States has handled this probably would have been more or less the same. One of the problems now is that the administration is navigating between a Republican Party that views itself as the Israel can do no wrong party and a Democratic Party, which is deeply divided between progressives who want to impose costs and consequences on Israel, and more than one mainstream traditional supporter of Israel who are Democrat senators who are increasingly frustrated and are pushing the administration to use American leverage. And Joe Biden, running for one of the most consequential elections in modern American history against the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, who is just waiting, it seems to me, to use the Israel-Hamas war to embarrass the president, is trying to figure out a way forward.
Just to take it back to the negotiations specifically in Cairo, none of what we have discussed, Aaron, is to say that we might not get there in terms
Correct.
of an agreement regarding a ceasefire. As you say, two speeds, slow and slower. But sometimes you do in these negotiations get that last-minute flurry of activity which gets us over the line. My problem is twofold. One, I can't see a set of circumstances in which Hamas gives up the one tool that it has at its disposal when it comes to negotiations in terms of the hostages. And on the Israeli side, how on earth can Benjamin Netanyahu countenance not just Hamas's continued existence, but their continued leadership of Palestine?
I think the only way that this could happen, and for reasons you suggest, the odds are not great, is if you fell back on a first stage agreement between Israel and Hamas, that in exchange for undetermined numbers, but an asymmetrical number of prisoners nearing 1,000, that is the women whose captivity is increasingly fraught, the elderly and the infirm, for 40 plus days of what you would describe as a temporary ceasefire. I think the Israelis were prepared to accept something like that. Hamas, for reasons that we've discussed, believe that they don't want to give up hostages for anything less than a full-blown Israeli commitment to end the war. That's the only pathway forward that I can see. Meanwhile, the Israelis launched the beginnings of a significant operation in Rafah, securing the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing in an effort to undermine Hamas sovereignty. Hamas was controlling that crossing point with a view toward trying to determine what else they intend to do in Rafah while not violating the so-called red lines, which often turn pink, I might add, with respect to Joe Biden's adamant opposition to a campaign that would put, 1 million plus Palestinians at risk. So that's the other unknown and uncertain factor here. I mean, we're 7 months into this war, and Hamas doesn't seem to be succumbing to Israeli pressure. But could that create an added advantage? I just don't know. And in the end, not even Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, reading the best of Godin trails, could figure out a way to tell you how we get out of this.
An appropriate point on which to conclude. Aaron David Miller, great to have your expertise on the podcast. Thanks for your time.
Well, thanks so much. And it's always great to see Dominic.
And you, Aaron.
So yes, our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, obviously was listening into that. I mean, fascinating character, Aaron David Miller, and a lot in there, I think, that we need to pick apart. I mean, what leapt out to you? I'm sorry, it was a bank holiday weekend, but I was still reading the news. And I have to say, I was incredibly frustrated at some of the reporting around what was going on, that Hamas had agreed to a ceasefire. Well, if you're going to say that, you can say that equally that Israel agreed to a ceasefire, just a different version, and neither of them agreed with the others, right? So listening to what Aaron was saying there, do you have any confidence that we are going to get to that point? I mean, I don't think he does.
I think Aaron's right in saying that the best chance of some kind of breakthrough is to appeal to the Israelis' predilection. They've always had this sort of tendency to take what you can. It's not ideal, it's not everything you wanted, but take what you can, bank it, and then hope in the future you can get more. So if they can get some kind of temporary ceasefire and get some of the hostages out,
sure,
then they might be persuadable. They're not going to guarantee to Hamas that there will be a ceasefire, but Hamas appear to have been told from a number of reports that the Americans have got some kind of commitment from the Israelis.
That's the thing I don't understand, because quite clearly there has either been a miscommunication or a complete disconnect between Washington and Tel Aviv on this point. Rafah is clearly carrying on despite, the US president of all people phoning him on his personal number. I mean, it just strikes me that they had the CIA, the head of the CIA in Cairo. The Americans thought this was going to take place, and I'm just really confused as to why they did.
I think Hamas was trying to give the impression that it was all over, and that would add more pressure on Netanyahu. And it's kind of wishful thinking. And I think we have to get also inside the heads of the Israelis here. I was there for the time when Gillott Shalit was a soldier taken by Hamas for a number of years, just one hostage, and that was agonising for Israelis. 133 hostages still being held. It's torment for the Israelis. So that's enormous pressure on Netanyahu to try and get at least some of them out, particularly the women, the children, and the ill. On the other hand, he knows if he does that, he probably loses the far right wing of his coalition. It collapses the coalition government. Even if that doesn't happen, prolonged ceasefire is going to put him under enormous pressure to bring about or to usher in some kind of elections, which he'll probably lose. So he's really got to choose between that side of the coalition and America and their support. And it's an impossible bind to be in. And the longer it goes on, the more painful it is for him. If I was to try and predict where it will go, I think there will still be pressure on trying to get him to go for some kind of temporary ceasefire that will give some kind of respite and get some of the hostages out. But at the moment, he doesn't look like he's going even for that.
Dom, take a breath. We'll continue to discuss the domestic pressures on Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet in a moment. Also, what has been happening in Rafah itself as that assault continues. Back in a second. Welcome back to The Daily. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, is still here. And Dominic, we ended the first half by talking about the hostages. The opposition leader, Yair Lapid, suggesting that the government is not serious about getting the hostages released. We have seen any number of demonstrations marching on Benjamin Netanyahu's official residence. Domestically, on the one hand, there seemed to be an incredible toughening, a hardening of their attitudes towards Palestinians. And yet, there are plenty of people whose family members have not been returned. I mean, how mindful do you think he has to be to those sorts of concerns?
Yeah, he has to be alive to a number of concerns. One is the hostages. There's enormous pressure for them to be brought out for any number of reasons. It's a small country, Israel, so everybody relates to any of these families who've, and they're on TV every night, and they are the most compelling, impressive people, some of the people I've ever interviewed. They have incredible courage and determination and optimism. They believe, they have to keep on believing they'll get their family members home. Otherwise, they will lose all hope. One woman said to me, she says, I said, you're incredibly strong. She says, I'm not. I'm very weak. And it's my weakness that keeps me going, because I know if I don't get them back, I will literally fall apart. So all of that they see on their TV every day. They also have, every family either has a soldier, a relative in Gaza fighting, or is about to, or they know another family who does. So it's all very personal and very close to them. So there's that enormous pressure on Netanyahu. But I think the most pressing immediate concern for him at the moment is, as Aaron was saying there, his survival. That depends on those far-right members of his coalition staying on board. And the more he goes towards a ceasefire or a cessation in fighting over Gaza, the more that coalition is likely to fall apart, and all of that could mean for him in terms of his own liberty even.
But of course, when we talk about Netanyahu's survival, we are talking about his political survival. When we talk about the people in Rafah right now, we're talking about their literal survival. Talk to me a little bit about the significance of the Rafah crossing having been taken by the Israeli military.
Yeah, so people have been following this that closely. The Gaza Strip is narrow and long, and at the bottom of it is Rafah. So most people are encouraged to move from the north
The
to the
Israelis
middle.
told them to go there, didn't they?
They told them to move down there. It's a very densely populated area at the best of times, but obviously its numbers have swollen enormously. Now, the Israelis have now urged those on the east of Rafah to move into Al-Mawasi, which is a more open area, or at least it was until a few months ago, when it's now become a tent city. If you listen to UNRWA and other aid agencies in Gaza, they said there's nowhere really left for those Palestinians. Al-Mawasi has reached capacity, they say, and it's dangerous to go further north. So all the aid agencies agree that it's impossible to imagine that the loss of life and the civilian suffering that will ensue if they do go in hard into Rafah. The Rafah crossing itself is this sort of narrow strip that is not normally held by the Israelis. But they've gone in there now. So I think the big question is that the beginning of a big Rafah operation which jeopardizes the lives and welfare of 1.4 million people, or is it just another form of leverage as part of these crucial negotiations?
You have to imagine, and as mentioned, we were talking to Aaron, Israel is heading to Cairo right now, and their line surely will be not direct negotiations, but the line that will be fed to Hamas is compromise, or we expand our operations in Rafah.
I suspect what Hamas would say back to that would be, well, if you do, you won't see your hostages again, and that's a very potent threat to the Israelis. So, it's impossible to see how it will play out. I think the negotiations will go on for some time. They're on life support for now, but I think the hopes and the optimism that we had at the end of last week, at the beginning of the weekend, they do seem to be fading pretty fast.
Just in terms of the Israeli position, they say we have two main aims. We want to see Hamas defeated and we want to see the hostages released. Don't they have a point then? They have to go into Rafah to fulfill those two.
I think for the Israelis, it's psychological, it's symbolic. It's the last bit of Gaza that they can go into. Once they've cleared that, then they can say they've done the best they can. But will it achieve their military aims? Almost certainly not.
We've talked so often, you and I, we've talked so often on this podcast about the humanitarian disaster that is the Gaza Strip right now. With the Rafah crossing closed, with the Kerem Shalom crossing closed as well, Erez has now closed. There's no aid getting in at the time when it is most desperately needed. And we already know in the north of Gaza, they're talking of famine conditions.
My suspicion is that is also part of the negotiating tactics, but it can backfire because, of course, Israel, as Aaron was saying there, is losing the PR war hands down around the world. It is a pariah state in the minds of many people, particularly younger people. So it's unconscionable, I think, in the minds of many people that you just simply shut those crossings. So I think the hope is they will be reopened quickly. There is the pier being built by the Americans.
Of course, yeah.
But there's the humanitarian situation in Gaza that has for months now been close to catastrophic is going from bad to worse.
But to kind of almost to conclude where we started, the Palestinian Authority is now calling directly for the United States to intervene to prevent what they say is the invasion of Rafah. We'll see what happens with that. But we are seeing the limits of US influence on, as Aaron David Miller described it, the United States' closest ally, certainly in the region and probably in the world.
Yeah, we see the limits of their influence, but also I think the limits of what they're prepared to do to exert their influence. So far, they've not done enough to pull Netanyahu back from the brink. They made it very clear they didn't want him to go into Rafah. He's now going into Rafah. So it's crucial to see what the Americans do in the coming days. Are they going to implement some kind of pressure, sanctions? Joe Biden is under huge pressure because, as Aaron was saying there, the election will come down to a number of states, some of which, and particularly in the youth generation, Gaza is now becoming a very pivotal issue in this election. So he is under enormous pressure to change things. So we'll have to see whether he does tolerate a Rafah incursion. So far, the administration seems to be. I think their hope is that this is all negotiating tactics and some kind of deal can be found in the coming days. But it's a very difficult circle to square.
Certainly is. Dom, always good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Neil.
The Middle East defies easy explanation. The subtleties and nuances of centuries of religious, commercial and geopolitical toing and froing are evident only after years of study or lived experience. And yet, a couple of things are clear. The humanitarian situation in Gaza will be made much worse by a full-throated assault on Rafah. And a ceasefire is not a ceasefire if one party agrees to it whilst ducking for cover. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you soon.